she thought you'd be interested to hear about. Okay, my job titles. I started out as a programmer analyst. Then I went to a senior programmer analyst. I was a computing supervisor. And then I went back to being technical because I didn't like the supervising part of it. And I ended up being a consultant at a credit card company I worked for too, Total Systems. So I have 20 years total in doing programming. I did COBOL, CICS, IMS, DB2. Things are extinct now that they call legacy programming. How did I become a programmer? I started off in school studying art.
Oh wow, really?
And I was working as a dishwasher in the International Student Center in order to support myself through college. It was cheaper, a lot cheaper back then. And so I was doing that, and then I'd see the people that graduated with degrees in art were working as salespeople at department stores. So after I finished that degree, I had a boyfriend who was an engineer. He suggested that I maybe need a business degree instead. So then I started studying business administration. So I started off with accounting because that seemed like a practical thing that everybody would need to have. Well, accounting was pretty boring. So I took a basic language, basic programming language, and although I had quite a few go-to loops in there, I found out it was really interesting to do the programming. And then I took some COBOL classes, and I got my degree in business information systems. And then when I went to for my job search after I got out of college, I found out from the professors at the school what was a good salary, entry-level salary. And I looked for a job. The first place I went to said, well, they asked me how much I wanted to earn, and I said, well, between the, I don't know, it was probably $16,000 and $18,000, which at that time was quite a bit in the 1980s. And they said, you'll never get that much. I thought, okay, fine, I'll go someplace else. So I did find a job, an entry-level job at an aerospace company. Aerospace is a good industry for women and minorities because they are trying to get quotas. So I got a job at Northrop Corporation in Los Angeles, and I studied COBOL programming in school at Cal State LA, but the programming, they wanted us to study programming and do things their way. So they had a 6-week extensive training class for us when we were hired. And by the way, I got the salary that they had told me that I was going to get from the aerospace company. So never give up. So I went through and while I did study programming in school, when they did this training programming, they wanted us to learn their methods of doing programming, their methods of doing, we had to learn the language for file structures to run the programs too, called JCL. And so we had to learn their methods or their standards for those things at the company. And while I had studied COBOL in college, was nothing, I wasn't prepared really to write programs yet because I didn't have a strong enough background just from going to college just to go out there and start changing programs. So it was a good experience. We were still doing it on cards. There was no terminals or TSO terminals or anything like that. We were still doing card punch decks of cards. And they counted how many times we took to compile our programs or put them together, and then after we finished the 6 weeks of training, they ranked us, and then they assigned us to our departments. So that was a good experience to go through, and that was a good job that I had for 3 years. After 3 years, inflation was pretty high at that point, and there's a thing called salary compression. If you stay too long at a company, then your salary is not equal to the people that are coming in as entry-level people or coming in from the outside. So in order to better myself, I had to leave to go to a different company, but I didn't quit my job at that company. The worst thing you can do is to leave a company before you have another job at another company. That because you lose a lot of leverage there. So I interviewed at another company, and I figured I have nothing to lose. They asked me what salary I wanted. Usually it's not good to state a salary and say, it's better to find out what they're going to offer you. So I didn't tell them. I said, just make me a reasonable offer. Well, after a while, they made me an offer, and I just turned it down because I had a set point in my mind of getting 30% raise, and I figured, well, they probably won't give me 30%, but 20% is fine. So I'm not sure what they offered me, but I said, no, I don't. That's not good enough. So then they said, well, what would you want? And so I gave them this outrageous figure I thought they would never give to me. So they said, well, we have to get authorization from our supervisor to make you an offer that high. So they came back and made me the offer, and I got that. I was surprised, but I had bettered myself by getting that other job, and then after a couple of years I was a supervisor. When I was a supervisor as a woman, I was only 28 years old, and I was having people work for me, men who were 40 years old. So the way that I dressed, I had to dress very conservatively, and like wearing suits, I wore suits every day, dressed very conservatively, try to look older than I really was in order to gain the respect of these older men that were working for me. Okay. I found that working as a woman working in a man's field, that men are looking for, your supervisors are looking for you to do a good job. They're not looking for you. It's very important not to gossip, and I know where I work now, I'm a teacher. Gossip is important part of the job. Well, in a technical world, that's not the thing to do. The best thing to do is to do a good job. Men respect that you do a good job. I had worse experiences working for women or with other women because they were they were trying to stab you in the back.
Catty.
So, yes, catty, exactly. Right. So I just had better experiences working for men than for women because they respected that you did a good job, and it was harder. Although I can't say that I didn't work for good women. There are good women managers out there, and I did have one in Atlanta who was from Bank South, and I was working in Charlotte, in the Bank of America in Charlotte while she was in Atlanta, and she pretty much just let me work on this project by myself. and just asking what I needed for support. So she was a very good manager. I liked her style of management. But I think she was, of all the people I worked for, unusual for a manager. I think the IT industry could get more women interested in programming if they try to approach them younger, like while in high school or even in middle school, to get them to try out programming to see what it's like. Because I didn't know that until I went to college, what programming was and what it involved. And I think if you start at a younger age and get women interested in it, then I think that would help them to see that it's a fun thing to do. And one thing I found out when I went to school, when I went to college, I had a very difficult time concentrating on my studies. And I'm pretty sure that I have attention deficit. Well, going to school was very difficult, but working in the technical industry was the best thing in the world for me to do, because they would, if I started on one job, they might change their mind the next day and then say, work on this job. I would be working maybe on 3 things at once, and I didn't mind switching back and forth, and I was never bored. I was always solving problems. It was very interesting. Where I worked in programming, there was usually 2 departments. One department was maintenance, which was like problem solving of the systems, and then there would be a different department that was new development. And I liked doing new development because that was like writing new programs. The support also I thought was interesting because it was solving problems, and that was always different. You never would come across the same problem twice. So that was, for having attention deficit, that was great, because you never would come across the same problem twice, and that was very stimulating for me. I don't know, is there anything else? Okay, when I worked for Continental Airlines, designing their master schedule for the pilots of like which flights they would be flying on, and we had to go to Houston and actually talk to the upper management to figure out what they wanted in their systems. So we talked directly. There weren't any like analysts who were in between. We talked directly to the top management people, which I was very shocked to find were just egotistical and disorganized. How I couldn't believe that they were running the companies, but I had never met any high executives before, so I was really surprised. And we asked them questions about the system. We would have to go by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Regulations for the pilots. We'd have to have those, program those rules into our systems, and also the contracts. The pilots and flight attendants had contracts with the airlines, and we had to follow those contract rules. So we'd ask them different conditions. Well, what happens if a pilot flies 8 hours? Or they didn't know. They weren't able to give an answer. They just hadn't thought of all the conditions. So that was interesting to observe that people at a higher level of management still didn't know. They didn't know how to interpret their contracts, and so that was an interesting experience to deal with them. And most of the people in top management on the airlines were pilots themselves. And they're very egotistical, and they were interesting to deal with. We designed one system where they had to use a screen themselves to like trade trips, and they would called up my supervisor and said, "We can't figure this out." And she said to them, "You're flying a 747. It can't be that complicated." Okay, does anybody have any questions would like me to answer? Yes?
What was the best, out of all the fields you've been in, which one did you like the best?
This is a strange reason, but I liked working for the airlines because I got free airline trips.
That's not strange.
What's wrong with that?
The banks didn't give me free money, so I can't say.
Let's say those are some pretty decent benefits.
Yes. Having free airline benefits was nice. You could fly first class to London, so that was. Oh, my parents got the flight benefits too, so. Yes, ma'am.
Is there still opportunities out there for women who are older, and do you think it's better to have a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree in computer programming, computer science?
I think that you need to have a 4-year degree in anything right now. Just having a 2-year degree, you don't have an edge over other people. And having a 4-year degree, especially for if you work for the government, like for a government job, which is the government's a good place to work because they give you a retirement after only 5 years, but they also require that you have a 4-year degree. So I would recommend having a 4-year degree because of that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes?
You mentioned something, you were talking about working with the pilots and building the system and how they didn't really fully understand what it was that they wanted.
Right.
In your experience, how did you guys first approach that with them not knowing what they wanted? And second, in your experience, what would be your approach now as opposed to then?
What we had to do was come up with all the conditions that they were missing in their contract. Like they might not know if this happens and this happens, what do you do? So we had to explain to them that we need to know the answers to those questions before we can put it into code, translate it into code, because we have to take care of all conditions. So we had to find out from them all the missing conditions.
Any outliers as possible that you need to figure out.
Right, any kind of possible conditions. We had to get those answers from them. And they had to think about it because they weren't sure themselves how to interpret their contract. Their contract was very poorly written, and I don't know who decided. I guess the union decided what the pilot's contract would look like. How would you solve that in the future? I have them write better contracts. I mean, if they wrote it like that without all the conditions taken into account, there's nothing you could do without finding the missing information.
Well, I meant more is like, what approach would you take now as opposed to the approach that you took then? Such
Meeting
as,
with them.
yeah.
Like, would you do anything differently trying to handle the situation?
Because, okay, so I found myself in a similar situation. I work for a company doing development that is actually not a development company, and they have no developers. So I'm the sole developer at this company. So when you go and speak to management, and they say, well, I need this type of system, and I need it to run like this, and that's all they give you. They don't really understand the requirements themselves. And even with meeting with them, you run down the requirements list and say, hey, this is what I think we need to go over because I think this is where you're trying to go with the problem. Sort of the same situation, but they don't care because it's not code. To them, code is whatever you do, the magic behind the scenes. They just want to see a working system. So how would you approach that situation now as opposed to the way you approached it then?
You have to go from the end result and work backwards.
Okay.
What do you really want to design? What do you want to use it for? and find out the function of the system and what they want to use it for, and then work backwards from that in order to have to create it, what you need to do.
Let me respond a little bit as well, because if you're in web design or you're in programming, you're going to frequently run across that issue. You got to remember, there's a bunch of different types of people when it comes to creating computer programming. First of all, there's the business people who only speak business lingo. There are the technical people who, believe it or not, only speak the technical lingo. If you want to grow in this field, what you want to do is be an interpreter. What's typically the business analyst, which is the person that fits in between the business person and the technical person. That is, you got to be able to speak both languages. Business people don't want to speak technology. That's why they're not a programmer. And in a lot of cases, programmers don't want to speak business. That's why they didn't get a business degree. As you grow in your programming web design field, you want to get to the point where you can speak both languages, because frequently what you have to do is you got to find out how the systems work from the perspective of the users, like she was saying, in terms of backing into it, and then look at it from a business person's perspective, and then translate that into how to code it. Typically, that's the role of the business analyst, someone who speaks both languages, who can understand the business processes and understand the technology, and they take those business processes, translate them into business requirements, and then take those business requirements and translate them into code. And then the programmer usually take that code and then program it. So when you start out as a business, as a programmer, the next logical step is to be a programmer analyst, which is someone who can sit and talk to the user, understand how they use it from a business person's perspective, and then translate that into the technical specifications that are used by the programmers to program. So to answer your question, the way you got to handle it is you have to do some additional learning to understand how this system, if it's a paper-based system and you're trying to go from paper to computers, you got to understand how they're using the paper-based system right now. If it means additional reading, that's why being an accountant is so critically important for people who want to be in programming, because frequently, well, accounting is an area that uses programs a lot. So, and most programmers aren't accountants. Most accountants aren't programmers. So you need somebody who can speak both languages. And when you want to grow and progress in your business, you should learn the business side of it as well when you're a developer. So you got to learn how the business works, and then take that knowledge and translate it into the technical skill. You'll be golden in terms of how to get paid.
That's currently how I approach it.
You're a great man.
But I find sometimes there's still that disconnect between being a developer, even when you try and understand the rules and regulations of the business. But there's still that disconnect.
Oh, absolutely.
That you just, for whatever reason, you can't jump.
It's gonna be because again, you're speaking one language, they're speaking another. But they brought you in to code it. Yeah. Right? So that's what they're gonna expect you to do ultimately.
Regardless of the end result, they want me to code it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in a way that they can use it, not being a technical person.
Well, that's another thing that I was getting at. You were talking about how the pilots and the managers were very egotistical and kind of displaced in the situation between where you're trying to code the system and they don't really care, they just want the system. So, and that's a similar situation that I face. I approach the business aspect of it and say, hey, from a business standpoint, I see what you're getting at, but from a development standpoint, this is what we have to do. And then you get those spin-off remarks. Well, I don't really care, get it done. Or that's not what I wanted. You're going to have to fix that. Just situations like that. So those situations, and I bring that up here in this setting because I don't know how many developers we have here, but it's like you said, it's very commonplace. So
another thing you do is you try to include those guys. I know this is my presentation. One day I'm going to be asked to present, and I'll be able to stand up there. But another thing you do is you involve your users in the development process right from the beginning. And you build a little bit and then you test it. That way they get the input in as you building, as opposed to waiting till the end product and then they decide, well, that's not what I wanted at all. So when you involve them in early on, You can provide a little prototype, let them play around with that, see whether or not it works for what their needs are, meet their needs. If it doesn't, then you can change it right then and there. If it does, then you can go forward to the next phase and build another little piece of the puzzle. So you take it one step at a time and involve these users in right from the very beginning.
And just as a last remark to kind of tie up this question, what you said about your value to a company when you can work both ends of the puzzle, take that to heart. Because it wasn't very long ago I got an offer from another company, and the company I work for now was like, no, you're not going anywhere. We can't afford for you to go anywhere. Stay here.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's the reason I bring that question up. It's very important to be able to approach it from both ends.
Absolutely.
So.
Sorry, Ann.
That's
I
okay.
got to side myself.
That's exactly what we did for our master schedule system for the pilots. We set up a small prototype system, and we had them come and try it out. And they tried out the screens, and they found out how it's going to work, how is it going to check, because they had only a paper system at the time. But they were growing so fast, they had to automate the system because they weren't able. They bought so many airlines. There's no way they could have kept it as a manual system. So we made a prototype system, and they came from Houston to try it out and see how it was. Yeah, the people who were doing the scheduling manually didn't like the computer system, and once we implemented, they wanted to try it out and make sure that we were doing it, so they would calculate everything to be sure that it was correct. And the older people they were the most resistant to using the new system because they didn't trust it. And the newer people, the younger people, they were more amenable to it, and they were better users of the system because they could see its benefits. The older people were resistant to using it. Yeah, companies such as Lockheed, they want to keep their old systems because they have old people working there. And those people do not want to get rid of the systems. So they, even though they could have state-of-the-art systems, they don't want to, the managers don't want to rock the boat with those people because they don't want to give up what's tried and true for them. That's true, and then younger people come in and, well, I've even been at companies as a consultant, and I saw they're using this antiquated system from the 60s. In CICS, there's a file type that you save information one way. We said, well, we can get rid of this and put in this new system, and they said no. They forbid us to change anything. They said, no, we don't, it works, don't change it, just sit there and read your book until we're ready for you to program again. So that was really sad because we were willing to take the time to change it and make it better, but they wouldn't let us change it. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir?
Yeah, you said you're a teacher. What do you teach?
I teach second grade special education.
That's a tough crowd.
Now, did you have to go back to school to get an education degree?
Yes, I had to get it. Yes, I have 5 degrees.
Oh, wow.
So,
You said you studied.
Now, were you originally from?
yes.
Administration?
Yes.
How long?
I have a bachelor's degree in business administration and business information systems, master's degree in system management, also the education degrees.
Now, you from California?
No, my father was in the Air Force, so I'm from nowhere. Yes, I'm a citizen of the world. Yes, I like traveling.
Is your daughter a programming major?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I told her not to be a teacher.
You mentioned earlier that you work for a bank.
Yes.
What bank was that?
Bank of America and First Union in Charlotte. I worked as a consultant.
So, what did first, I guess, information systems? Or?
In information systems. I worked on the treasury system, where the accounts were mostly large corporations, and what they did was they had their money overnight. They would invest the money, so we had to manage the accounts of those people, because they have such large amounts of money, they could invest it overnight and make more money.
Oh, wow.
So those were the large corporate companies that kind of programming I did for them. Yes?
What made you change your majors like that? I mean, that's a big difference, like kids and computers.
Because when I got married and had kids, both my kids had disabilities. My daughter had a learning disability. She wasn't able to read, and when she went to 3rd grade at all. And so I could see that there was a lack of teachers, so that's why I could save people millions of dollars by doing programming projects, but they seem to take that for granted. I thought if I helped kids, then that would be a better use of my time. What I found out was that you don't get to help kids as a teacher so much. It has to do with the bureaucracy, and there's a lot of frustrating things to do with going to meetings, filling out paperwork. So it was very disillusioning for me.
Go ahead. No, it's fine. Go ahead.
No, earlier you said that accounting was boring. I just wanted to know, why do you think accounting is boring? I'm an accountant.
Oh, accounting was boring because it's always the same. Like I would do bookkeeping for the International Student Center where I worked, and every time I would do the books, well, I guess it was interesting because we had a lady who wrote checks, and she would put different amounts than the words and the numbers. And when I had to reconcile the bank statements, it was always wrong, and I would be missing 2 cents or 3 cents. And it took me, so that part was interesting and challenging, but mostly just doing the same thing over and over again, the same process. And what I wasn't really an accountant as much as I was doing bookkeeping. So for me, that was just the same thing over and over again. So that part wasn't, finding the bank account errors was interesting.
Are you an IT person too? In accounting?
No.
Just in accounting? Oh, she's in accounting. Just hanging out with us today.
Don't you enjoy it?
Okay.
But we need accountants too. So.
I mean, I enjoy it. I like numbers. And you said it's bookkeeping, that's why you did it. But
Right, accounting is
yeah,
different.
it's not only about bookkeeping.
Right.
You're doing payroll, you're doing taxes, you're doing all of these stuff at once. So it's not like, you're changing between one thing to another.
Right.
So that's, I like numbers. I don't like English. I don't like technology.
I'll make sure she doesn't come in next meeting.
Don't you need people to keep track of that stuff? So.
But I'm learning from it.
It's better to have it automated though than to do it. With
Yeah, I mean, the system you're
calculator.
using now for accounting, everything is automated. You're not using papers anymore. Everything,
Right.
you just have to plug the numbers in the system, like the ADP system and all these, like the payroll systems, and they're all automated. So we're not using
Technology.
Throat, not throat. Been happy with
I have a question. You were in the programming field for 20 years, and
Yes.
then you became a teacher.
Right.
What could convince you to go back to the programming field at all? Anything?
Because somebody offered me a job. Because I guess I was burned out after 20 years, and you don't know what anything else is except that that's the only thing I had done for 20 years. So I didn't see really the disadvantages and advantages of doing anything else before that. So I thought, but what I found out was I really did enjoy what I was doing before, but I didn't realize it. But now I would have to update my skills because nobody needs COBOL programmers anymore. So, but the business analysis skills I have are still valuable. And especially with the airline knowledge, it took me quite a while to understand the airline business and all that's involved with that, because they have a lot of esoteric terms and everything, and it took me a long time to understand that. And banking, I guess they have their terms too. And aerospace was building planes, so that, but the business analysis skills you still have. So even though I might not be able to actually do the coding, I do have the analysis skills. That's Bank of America. Bank of America keeps calling me and wanting me to come back too.
There's actually a rise in the number of students or number of degrees that are being, number of computer science degrees that are being handed out these days. And surprisingly, the reason that rise is taking place is that no matter what field you're in, having computer skills is beneficial. If you're an accountant, all accounting is computerized. If you're in aerospace, all of their systems are computerized. If you're in dentistry, you use computers. So the reason the number of computer science degrees are going up is a lot of students are taking computer science as a minor. Regardless of if they're an engineer, they take a computer science, they get a double major with a computer science degree. If you're in, if you get an MBA, you get a double major with a computer science degree. It kind of goes back to what we were saying in that discussion earlier about having the business knowledge combined with the technical knowledge. No matter what field you work in, computers impact it. And computers don't exist just for the sake of existing. They exist for the sake of doing accounting, for doing banking, for engineering. You see where I'm going? So you want to keep that in mind when you're planning out your career, because having that business knowledge, no matter what the business field is going to make you a more valuable IT person, regardless of what field you're in.
You can't get your associate or a bachelor's unless you have a computerized accounting specialist.
In accounting.
Yeah, you can't get it.
Yeah.
So everything is automated, basically.
Sure. This question.
Oh, sorry. Yes?
Okay. I noticed in the email the topic was women in technology.
Right.
So I had a question about that. You seem to have had a very good career over the period of 20 years. A lot of great jobs. My question is, do you feel at any point in time in your career, I know that you mentioned it a couple of times, but do you feel at any point in time in your career that being a woman impacted the way your career was being directed? And do you feel like any of those issues still exist today? And if so, how do you get around those issues?
Okay, when I started out, I was pretty sure that I was getting paid the same as the other people. But as I got more experience and went to different jobs, and I moved from the West Coast to the East Coast, I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. There I found out I was getting $10 an hour less than men who had a similar experience. So I'm pretty sure that still exists today. It's probably not as bad as it was. That was in 1995. So that still exists.
In your experience, how do you think that young women now should approach that situation if they find that they're in those situations? Or, I mean, at some point there's got to be a resolve for the situation. So what would be your recommendation to young women in that situation? How should they approach that now?
Well, the best thing to do is to find out comparable salaries. Like I brought in a salary survey from one of the consultant places I worked.
Okay.
Find out what you should be making and demand that you get paid the same as men because you deserve it. There's no reason why, if you're doing a comparable job, that you don't get the same amount of money. But it depends where you work. If you work on the East Coast, there's less discrimination against women. It depends where you live. Like in the Southeast, I think there's more of a problem with that. That's what I experienced. So, she was an engineer. There's still going to be discrimination against women who are in the technical field. But having this information, find out from other people what they're making, because knowledge is power. If you know how much the other people are making and you're not making it, then you can approach people and say, look, I found this out. And if they just don't want you to find that out.
So in your best recommendation, though, is just to be well informed going into the position and,
right.
and approach it from that information standpoint. I know that you're going to make this on a regular basis. This is what I would like to make.
Right.
Okay.
The lady who runs Sony, who left Sony because of that issue with the interview, the movie, she, you know, Sony was accused of paying female actresses less than they paid their male counterparts. So when they interviewed her and asked her about that, she said, well, hey, if I offer someone a salary and they accept it, I'm not going to turn around and say, should I offer you more? So she was emphasizing the same thing that Ann just said. You got to know what the going rates are. And one of the things that research shows is that women are less likely to be aggressive or assertive when it comes to asking for a raise or asking for more money, unlike men. Apparently, just but you got to do just that. And actually, if you're a guy, some men are also kind of intimidated, if I may use that term, about asking for a higher salary or asking for a raise. And in the business world, it's kind of expected that you toot your own horn and you're a little more assertive. So whether it's male or female, when it comes to salaries, you got to know what the going rate is. And you can't be shy about going into the boss and saying, you want a raise. And these are the reasons for wanting it. Because otherwise, like the lady said from Sony's, if I'm a manager, think about it if it were your business. If someone's willing to accept $10,000 when you would have paid them $20, what are you going to pay them? 10. So you really got to take the bull by the horns and go in and be more assertive, male or female, in terms of what the going rates are. If you're really good at what you do, it's almost expected that you're going to ask for higher pay, right? Quality service, quality product, you pay more money for it.
I think that I'd like to make a remark to that too.
Sure.
Especially if you're soon to graduate or if you're looking for a position in your field now, the same rule applies going into the job as an entry-level person as opposed to an experienced person. I learned this with my first job. When they call you in, especially if they approached you, you have negotiating power at that point. So if they give you less than what the entry-level market is, a lot of people are, okay, this is my entry-level job, I'll accept that and I'll move on. But you don't have to. I was in that situation, and I had another company call me and nag me, and I turned them down 100 times, and they said, look, just come down here and talk to us. So I did. I went back to my company, and I spoke with them, and I said, look, this is apparently the going rate for people with my experience level. And I got a 45% raise off the spot, off the mark, or 145% raise off the mark, just done. And I'd only been there 6 months. So when you go into these entry-level positions and you're good, and these companies have approached you, that same intimidation applies. I don't want to ask for too much because I don't want to negotiate myself out of the job. But then you have to remember, they approached you. They asked you to come in and sit with them. So that, I think that same rule applies as far as knowing what you're worth when you go in, being informed, and being aggressive to get through.
And companies expect that you're going to negotiate. It's a negotiating process. It's like buying a car. If you go in the car lot and you pay the listed price on the car, which it's expected that you don't do that. But if you're willing to do it, then they're going to take your money. If you know that the process going in is that you negotiate, then everybody expects that you're going to negotiate. So